Hello and welcome to part one of the lecture for chapter 20. I'll forewarn you, this one is going to be a little bit longer than these usually are. I usually try to keep them under 15 minutes, but there's quite a bit to talk about here to get you far enough to have you be successful with your homework. So this chapter deals with process costing, so we'll start out by kind of defining what that is. I'm going to focus on a cost of production report, and you'll find a couple of files in Canvas that'll be helpful to you. One is a template called the cost of production report. Then there's one with codes to it that help you see what goes where and how to follow it through. The publisher, I think, doesn't do a great job of giving you an overview of this particular report, and so I like my template better. I'm going to recommend that you use my template in solving homework problems and then use it to get your answers from there, and I'll walk you through part of that today. We'll talk about journal entries for process cost systems, how we account for what we get from the cost of production report, and then how we can use the information for decision making. So a bit of a review, job order cost systems, that's where each output is unique, like a custom motorcycle shop or a custom home builder. That's going to have a cost flow like you see here. Direct materials coming in, direct labor coming in, applied overhead, or overhead being applied to specific jobs where we accumulate cost in those jobs. Our work in process account is the summary of those job order cost sheets. When the jobs are finished, they go to finished goods, and when they're sold, they go to cost of goods sold. So contrast that to a process cost system, which is a different kind of factory. In that case, direct materials, direct labor, and applied overhead are going to be coming into each department. So in this, I think it's an example of making aspirin. So I'm going to have a mixing department where I'm going to gather all the materials I need to make aspirin and mix them all together. And then I'm going to be using direct materials in that process, obviously direct labor, and I'm going to be applying overhead to that process. And then I'm going to transfer that cost over to tableting, where they have machines that take the stuff I mixed up and turn it into tablets. So in that department, there may be additional direct materials or maybe not, but there's definitely labor and there's applied overhead. Then we'll transfer those costs, which include what we inherited from the mixing department. We'll pass that down to the bottling department. So they're going to add some direct materials, the bottle and the cap and the cotton that goes in it and the label and the box the bottles go in. They'll have direct labor for doing that process, and they'll apply some overhead. They may have their own supervisors, own forklift drivers, all of that. So now that cost is going to have accumulated across that whole flow, and the costs are going to follow the flow of the product and accumulate as it goes through the factory. And then when it's done, in the bottling department in this case, it'll get transferred to finished goods, where it'll sit until a customer buys it. So a process manufacturer, remember, produces products that are indistinguishable from one another. So candy, bags of cement, lumber, a business that I had a lumber mill, and so all of the boards we produced were the same as each other. So we use this type of system, gasoline. Those are all different examples of companies that would use a process cost system. And a process cost system is going to have a department or process. We're going to record the cost for each of those things, okay, for each department. So here's an example from the book where you see down below we have one factory and we have job order cost sheets to accumulate the cost for each particular job. And in process costing, we're going to have a work in process account for each department where we'll accumulate cost and then transfer those costs on to the next department where we accumulate some more costs. So in process costing, I'm going to have multiple work in process accounts. So a summary of what I just said, job order costing, one work in process account, it equals the sum of the job order cost sheets. Process costing, each department will have its own work in process account, where I will debit work in process department A and put cost into it. I'll debit work in process department B and so forth. You can see when I transfer costs from one to the other, I'm going to debit the department it's going into and I'm going to credit the department it's coming out of. That's how I'll move costs between work in process accounts. So again, the key thing is cost follow the physical flow. So here's an example from a simple factory from the first lecture that I gave, and now I've expanded it. So now we've got two different work in process departments, mixing and packaging in this simple business. So I purchase materials, they come into my purchases building. Think of these like separate buildings. So they sit in that warehouse until a requisition is created from the mixing department saying, hey, I need some of those raw materials. So we bring that into our first department, work in process mixing. We add labor to that we get from timesheets. We apply factory overhead to that, and each one of these departments can have its own predetermined overhead rate. So we apply overhead to the production that we do. When we're finished with that production, we transfer it to the next department, transfer the product and the costs. Now in the second department, packaging, I may have some more direct materials that kind of go around the mixing department and come into packaging. I'm definitely going to have some direct labor, and I'm going to apply factory overhead with the predetermined rate for that department. And then when I'm done, now it's gone through the two departments it needs to, then I'll move that over into my finished goods warehouse, where it'll sit until it's sold and released as cost of goods sold. So that's kind of a map if you think about having a raw materials building, mixing department building, packaging department building, and then finished goods warehouse, how the costs would move through those buildings. So here's the same information in T accounts, and I'd maybe recommend printing this slide in full size and reading it in detail. I won't read it to you here, but you can basically see that same flow I just described with materials coming in on the debit side for materials and leaving on the being credited. And when I credit materials, I debit work in process mixing, and then I debit for direct labor, debit for factory overhead. When I transfer cost out, I credit that work in process account and debit the next department 2 work in process account where I accumulate more cost. Then I transfer those to finished goods and then to cost of goods sold. So the cost of production report is the key to this whole process. And that's why I kind of created my own template that I think you'll find helpful. So the purpose of doing a cost of production report is to determine the number of units that your department is responsible for. So for example, if you were in the mixing department, how many pounds or gallons of material did you mix? Okay, what did you do? You want to get credit for what you did. So we're going to first look at how many units we're dealing with, and then we're going to look at the production cost. So we know how many units we created, we know what the production costs are, then we can come up with a cost per unit, and we can use that to say, well, we started out with some money in our work in process account for our department, we added a bunch to it, so we've got this money we're responsible for. How much of that should be associated or allocated to the parts that moved on to the next department versus the stuff we still have sitting here that we're working on? So how to divide the cost into those two buckets is the key to the report. So we need to do this process in order to come up with that entry where we debit the work in process for department 2 and credit the work in process for department 1. That's the objective here, is to be able to get the information to make that entry. So there are 4 steps in preparing the report and 4 sections of the report. The first one deals with the whole units to be accounted for. So we're going to have to take into account that all of the production we did wasn't in whole units. We had some units partially done that we finished, okay, and then we've got some units we started and finished, and then we've got some units that we started but didn't finish. So we've got some fractional units that we need to deal with. So we'll use that, and that's how, when we do that, we'll compute the equivalent units of production. Okay, that's whole units of what we did. We'll use that information to determine the cost per equivalent unit, and then use that cost per equivalent unit to allocate the cost to what we transferred out and what is in ending work in process or partially completed units. So I'm going to talk about the first two steps in this lecture, and then I'll cover steps 3 and 4 in the next lecture. So the first one, computing whole units to be accounted for. That's what are we responsible for in terms of units. So I want to determine the whole units that are in beginning work in process inventory. So how much do I have to do to finish off the work in process, or no, excuse me, it's whole units and work in process. So regardless of how much they're done, how many units are there, okay? I add to that the number of units I started in production during the period. So the sum of those two figures is the number of units I'm responsible for. So if I start well, I have an example here, I'll show you next. So I'm doing a chair factory here as the example. So I come in and there are 6 chairs that are in some stage of completion. So I just use the number 6. I don't worry about what stage of completion they're in. There are 6 chairs there that are partially done. During the month, I start another 50 into production. I didn't finish all of them, but I started 50 into production. So I'm responsible for what happened to 56 chairs. Okay, I have to answer for that. Okay, step 2 is to compute the equivalent units. So the starting point is what I just mentioned. I have units in beginning work in process. I have units that I started and completed during the period. So that's going to be probably a smaller number than what I started. Okay, and then I'm going to have ending work in process. Okay, and I'll go through some examples where we work that out. So the key thing here is a lot of times they'll tell you they'll tell you how many units were started, but not how many were started and completed. So we'll have to figure that out. So that's going to be important. Okay, next slide. So the conversion cost, that's the labor and overhead, are assumed to enter the process evenly throughout the period. Okay, so that's in all cases, we're assuming an even flow of labor and factory overhead into the units, and we combine those two. If you remember from chapter 18, we combine those two and call them conversion costs. Now, in terms of when the materials go into the system, it could be one of a couple of different assumptions. So the materials could flow into production at the same rate that the labor does, okay? So every time somebody is working on a part, they're grabbing the parts from raw materials that they need for that production. That doesn't happen very often. Usually it's more likely that the material comes in at the beginning of the process. So the first thing you do is get all the materials together that you need, and then you'll work on it until you get it done. It's technically possible for the materials to come in at the end, and that could be maybe like a packaging operation where you get everything all ready and the last thing is the packaging that gets included. So we're going to have different numbers for equivalent units of production for material depending upon when the material goes in the process. So let's take a look first where it's the simplest, where everything comes in evenly throughout the process. So let's assume in our example that when we started at the beginning of the month, we walk in the first day of production and we've got 6 chairs that are 1/3 done, okay? Then I find out that I started and completed 50 chairs, okay? And then in ending work in process, let's assume I have 8 chairs that are 3/4 done. So I need to come up with a number of units for what I got done, what I accomplished, okay? So the right number isn't 6 plus 50 plus 8. You know, that does, because I didn't do all the work for all of those chairs. So you think about it and how it really happens. So when I come into the beginning of the month, I've got those 6 chairs that are 1/3 done. That means I had to do the other 2/3 of the work on those 6 chairs in this month. So in a way, I get credit for the equivalent of 4 whole chairs. So I want the numbers to be in whole chairs. So doing 2/3 of the work on 6 chairs is the same as doing all of the work on 4 chairs, if that makes sense. So for the units I started and completed, that's 50. I get full credit for those. And then the ending work in process, I want to look at getting credit for what I did. So I'm not looking at what needs to be done. That'll happen next month when it becomes the beginning for next month. But for ending, I'm going to look at what I have into it. So if I have 8 chairs that are 3/4 done, that's the equivalent of doing the work on 6 full chairs. So the right number of equivalent whole units for what I did would be, in this case, 4 plus 50 plus 6, or 60 chairs is the correct measure of what I accomplished. Now, the one thing I want to mention to you about how your book will say things in problems quite often is they'll say you had 6 chairs in beginning work in process, and you transferred 56 chairs to the next department. Okay, they'll tell you how many in total went to the next department, and you have to figure out the number 50 for what you started and completed. So the logic there is, if I had 6 on the workbenches when I came in, and if at the end of the month I looked at the total I transferred and that's 56, well, the first 6 came from my beginning inventory, so I must have then started and finished 50. So I need to come up with that number quite often, because that's the number in the middle I get full credit for. So that's if the materials and the conversion costs go in at the same rate. We would use 60 equivalent units of production for both materials and for conversion cost. Now, in the rest of our examples, conversion cost will stay at this model. That won't change. So what we'll be looking at next are just changes to the material portion. So if the materials go in at the beginning of the process, which I mentioned is the most common, then I'm going to assume that I didn't have to add any materials to that beginning stuff when I came in on the first day of the month. So I started on the first day of the month. All the material must have been there for those chairs. I just hadn't finished the labor. So I get no credit for what I had to add materials this month because I didn't have to add any. Okay, so 0% for beginning. The ones I started and completed, I get full credit for those. I had to add all the material for those during this month. And then ending work in process, if the material goes in the beginning of the process, then I'm going to have the material there for all 8 of those chairs, regardless of the fact of what percentage they're done. So I get credit for material for 8 chairs in what I started and ending. So the equivalent units of production in this case for materials are 58. So I could quite easily have problems where I have one equivalent unit of production, one number for equivalent units of production for materials, and a different number for conversion costs. So now the example, and you can kind of follow this logically, if the materials go at the end of the process, like packaging say, then my beginning work in process, I'm going to have to add all the materials to that, because I have to finish it off and it comes in at the end. So I get credit for 6 chairs there. And the same 50 that I start and complete doesn't matter. And then I get 0 credit for the ending work in process because the materials haven't been added to that yet. It doesn't happen until stuff is done, and by definition that isn't done. So in that case, if the scenario was that it happened at the end of the process, we'd have 56 for our total. So the problem will always tell you how materials flow in, but assume that conversion costs are evenly throughout the process in all cases. So the last thing I want to show you is the top portion of the template. And there'll be a couple of files on Canvas I'd like you to look at. One is this. You might want to print this out. It's an example. So it'll say cost of production report example. There'll be a template that you can print out for blank for doing work. And then there's the one with the codes I mentioned. So in this case, step 1 is to do that top section. I started with 6 chairs in inventory. I started 58 during the month in this example. So I have 60 that I'm responsible for. Okay. And then the next section deals with the calculation of equivalent units of production. And now I've got a column for direct materials and a column for conversion cost, and that first column is whole chairs. So I had 6 whole chairs. I started and completed 50, and I have 8 in ending work in process. That 64 total for equivalent units under the whole column needs to equal the 64 that's up in the first section. If those numbers don't equal each other, chances are you have a problem with the started and completed number during the month. That's usually where the mistake is. And notice I've got a column for the percentage that's complete. So for the materials column, in this case, I can tell materials must go in at the beginning of the process because I get 0 credit for direct materials going into beginning work in process. I get full credit for the 50, and I get full credit for the 8 that I started. So my equivalent units of production with respect to materials is 58. For conversion costs, I had those 6 whole units that were 1/3 complete, so I have to do the other 2/3 to finish it. That's 4 equivalent units. I get credit for the 50. And then I have 8 units that are 3/4 done. That equals 6 units, so I get credit for 6, so I have 60. So this follows the example I gave you earlier. So tomorrow I will do a couple of problems similar to your homework and post videos of those. So I would recommend you watch that before you start your homework for Monday. Thank you very much.